What's up, guys? Welcome back. So in today's video, I'm going to be replacing the front wheel bearings on my 100 series Toyota Land Cruiser. And this video is a part of a full series of videos I'm doing on everything that you need to know to restore the stock drivability and handling of your 100 series Land Cruiser. So check that out. The link to that playlist will be in the description of this video, and be sure to subscribe for future videos. As far as this job goes, I've actually already done it, and I'm really satisfied with the results. After replacing the wheel bearings on my truck, the front end was definitely a lot quieter, things were smoother, and I think just altogether a little bit more put together. For me, my wheel bearings were already pretty loose, so the way you could tell is to lift one wheel off the ground at a time, grab the wheel at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and shake it back and forth. And if you get any play that comes from the wheel or the hub itself, especially if the spindle itself isn't moving, then you know you have loose wheel bearings, and you'd probably benefit from repacking your bearings with grease, retorquing everything at the very least, possibly also replacing the bearings themselves. Now, bearings don't wear out too quickly on these Land Cruisers. Toyota puts some pretty high quality bearings in, but for me, in my case, my car had 300,000 miles on it. I knew my wheel bearings had been loose for some time, and also recently they started kind of making a little bit of a clicking noise every once in a while. So the decision for me was easy. And then the last thing I'll say is, whenever you do jobs like this that relate to safety, make sure that you check out the factory service manual so that you don't miss any steps. But hang tight and I'll walk you through my process. All right, so here are all the tools and part numbers you'll need for this job. These are the oil seals, which aren't necessary you can replace the wheel bearings and not do these, but they were only 30 bucks a piece, and I wanted to make sure my seals were good so I don't ruin my brand new bearings. These gaskets correspond to each of these, to 2 of those. I have this wheel bearing kit from Cruiser Outfitters, and the brand is Temp. So Toyota actually doesn't make wheel bearings. In the original vehicles, at least like the United States sold 100 series, they use that Temp brand. So these are as close to OEM as you can get. The kit comes with the outer bearing and race, inner bearing and its race, an oil seal which you'll need, 2 washers here. One is a locking washer. This is a gasket for the drive flange. And then I also separately ordered these C-clips from Cruiser Outfitters that are of varying widths. You want to make sure you put the widest C-clip on that you can get on. I'll explain that a little bit later. Then I have this 54mm hub socket, which we'll need to kind of get the wheel bearing loose. I have basic metric sockets and wrenches, brass drift, and a hammer to get we'll have to kind of get the races out of the hub, and then this will also be helpful to get the cone washers out of the drive flange. Some kind of reverse pliers to get the C-clips off, and then you can use any brand that you want. You want to use high temperature grease, make sure it's this NGLI, and then you could see recommended for heavy duty automotive service, including wheel bearings. Just make sure that it's grease that's designed for wheel bearings. You can even ask AutoZone, which I did, to make sure that this is a fit for the Land Cruiser. I have some brake cleaner, and then you're definitely going to want some rubber gloves for this job. I like this brand a lot. You can get them on Amazon, and they're pretty durable. All right, so the first step is to take the caliper off and kind of get it out of the way. There's just 2 17mm bolts that mount it onto the back of the spindle. You can also take this guy and this guy off to give the brake line a little bit more room so you can get it out of the way. And then the next thing is to take the dust cap off with a chisel. Just try to work something into the edge there and go all the way around. This little cap will pop right off. And use your C-ring pliers to get your C-ring off. The next step is to take the drive flange off. So to do that, just loosen all these 14mm bolts. And you can see there's also a washer and a cone washer that seats into the drive flange. So we're gonna have to knock all of those out. And the best way to do that is to take a brass drift and just punch the bolt. You want to keep the nut on, not so much that you'll hit the nut and damage the threads, but you know, enough that I guess when that cone washer comes loose, it won't shoot across the room and get lost. So that just takes some patience. If you go around and kind of hit each of these with a brass drift and a hammer, they'll eventually work themselves out to the point where maybe even you can grab them with pliers and pull them out. If that doesn't work, another trick is to take a socket, an impact socket. I use 16 millimeters, one that would fit over the bolt and over the cone washer. And if you hammer the end of that, it'll send vibrations all around that cone washer and it'll eventually kind of work its way out. If you're having trouble, like I said, just be patient, use some penetrating oil if you have to, but these should all come out pretty easily. All right, once you get the dry flange off, you want to kind of inspect the surface. Make sure there's no bits of gasket stuck on it. You can use a razor blade to clean that off and get it really smooth. The same goes for this side. You can see I have some like old gasket stuck here, so I'll have to get that off with a razor blade to make sure that there's a really smooth and flush mount when I put everything back together. And then this guy right here is that 54 millimeter nut that holds the hub onto the spindle. So we'll have to get this one off first. To do that, I'm gonna have to use like a chisel or a screwdriver and a hammer to knock back some of these metal tabs out of the way. This is essentially a locking washer that when this was installed, those tabs were bent over this nut to ensure it doesn't spin. So we'll have to get that out of the way and get this guy off with our 54 millimeter socket. All right, after we got that one off, we wanna take this old locking washer out and then do the same with the next nut. All right, once the second nut is off, everything should be pretty loose. So we can just grab the rotor by both ends, pull everything off. When you do, there's one more washer, which you can kind of see right there, and then the outer bearing are gonna probably fall out, which is fine. Set those aside. Now on the back side, you can see the oil seal, or one of the oil seals, and then just inside of that, you can see the inner bearing. So I'm gonna show you a little trick to get those off. We're gonna put all this back on, but without the outer bearing. All right, so the hub's back on, but the only thing that I put back in was one of the washers and just thread it on a little bit. That way I can grab both ends of this rotor, pull it off. The inner bearing and that oil seal should kind of meet that nut and get popped out by that motion. See the bearing and the oil seal there. There's that nut I was using and everything out of the hub. So next step is clean everything up, get all this old grease out of the bearings. If you're gonna reuse them, don't worry about it if you're gonna replace them. But you wanna get all the grease off the spindle, all of this grease out of the hub, and then next we'll remove this old oil seal and put our new ones in. All right, so these are just 4 12 millimeter bolts, and you can remove this old oil seal and its gasket. And honestly, I don't know that I needed to do this. It's in pretty good shape. I don't see anything wrong with the rubber, so you guys might not have to, but if you want to, that's how you do it. This is the ABS sensor, so just make sure you don't break that. I'll put the gasket on. I'll probably clean the surface up a little bit, put the gasket on, put this guy on, and I could not find torque specs for this anywhere. I did find them for the 80 series Land Cruiser, and it was 34 foot-pounds for each bolt, so that's what I'm gonna use. If any of you guys find those or know what they are, feel free to drop them in the comments for other folks to use. All right, so once we have all the grease out, just looking for the front, you can see this is the outside race. Right here closest to us is the thin edge of it, and then the thicker edge is a little bit further back. So we're gonna start by punching that out. To do that, you need to flip it over. And by the way, if you don't have wood blocks or something to support this, use some cardboard so that these bolts don't get scraped up on the concrete or even bent. Definitely don't want to do that. But you can see these little ledges, 4 of them, that'll allow you to use your brass punch and slowly work around and knock that race out of the front. And then this is the inner race, which is a little bit bigger right here, and it actually has 4 ledges just like that on the inside, so we could flip everything over and do the same thing to get the inner race out. So just be patient with that. Make sure you're not going too fast on one side, that it's all even, and both those should come out pretty easily. So there's the inner race all cleaned off. It looks really good. There's no kind of clear sign of wear here. You can see the Timken brand name on there still. So it looks like it's in pretty good shape. All right, so once we have those out, we just want to get the new races in. You can kind of seat those in here as evenly as you can, and then maybe get a block of wood or something to get it started. If you have a bearing driver, those work really well. I don't. So another trick is to use the old race, cut a slit in it, and use the old race to kind of drive the new one in. And since there's a slit, it'll be a little smaller and easier to kind of knock out after the fact. So if you do this, make sure you use the fat end of the old one to drive the new one in. That way, if you have to, you can flip it over and use your punch to catch this edge of the old one to get the old one out. All right, so you kind of just work your hammer all the way around, get it all the way in. Once you hear the sound change, it'll be, when you're driving the new race in, it'll sound kind of like a dull sound, and when you get it seated all the way to the lip, you'll hear a much sharper kind of sound. So the way that worked out for me is the old race is just sitting a couple millimeters above this old ABS sensor. So that worked really well because I was able to kind of continue hammering without worrying about damaging that. So I think this one's all the way seated, and I could just, with that slit in there, kind of pull it out with my hand. So looks good. Just kind of repeat that on the other end. All right, the outside's a little bit trickier. On one hand, it kind of seats itself well, so I don't have to worry about it going in on one side more than the other as I start it. On the other hand, if I put my old bearing or old race in here, these bolts are in the way for the hammer. So I think I'm going to use my brass drift kind of like this and hammer it in that way and see how far I get with that. All right, so that's what fully seated looks like with the outside race. The second race is just a few millimeters inside of the edge of the hub there. Gonna pull this out, and then you can even see it. Flip things over. You can see right there, there. You can see that that race is fully seated inside the hub. So now we're ready to pack our bearings and kind of pack this cavity with grease and get everything back together. All right, so this is a pretty messy process, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna take some grease and get it in our palm, and we're gonna work it into this crack of the bearing, kind of like this, until we see it come out the other side. And then we're just gonna rotate around and work that grease all the way in until the whole bearing is packed with grease. Then we'll kind of get some extra grease around the edge here. We'll seat the bearing. Then we're gonna take this oil seal, and the oil seal goes flat side up and gets pressed into here. So probably some, taps of the hammer should do it. And that'll get that inside bearing packed and seated the right way. Before we put the oil seal on, actually before I pack this bearing maybe even, I'm gonna take a bunch of grease and kind of fill this cavity inside, behind, kind of between the two races. The way that should look is it should be filled with grease so that grease almost sits level from the edge of one race to the edge of the other. In other words, that whole cavity is filled with grease. So I have this one done. Be careful when you're putting this oil seal in. I dented mine a little bit even with a brass drift. So it's probably best to just really carefully tap this in. I even have the brass drift put some dents in it there. I think it'll be fine. I probably didn't change the shape of this inner seal too much, but just be aware of that. All right, so the next step is to get some grease on your spindle and just around this oil seal. You can also put some extra grease around this oil seal. Then we'll go ahead and get the hub mounted on the spindle. It'll be pretty loose because we won't have the front end done yet, or the outside end. But while that's up there, we can go ahead and pack the outer bearing in hand, place it in, and then screw one of the hex nuts on to hold everything in place. All right, so once we have the second bearing in and the washer and the nut, we're gonna go ahead and torque it down to 43 foot-pounds first. We'll spin everything to make sure that it is spinning appropriately. Then we'll back it off and finger tighten it, and then we'll actually torque it down to 6 foot-pounds, and then test everything again. So the purpose is first to do everything tight to make sure everything sits correctly, loosen it up, and then set it to its final torque setting of 6 foot-pounds. All right, with this torqued down to 6 foot-pounds, we can put our locking washer in, and again, make sure that tab lines up with the channel there on the right side. Then our second bolt, which is over here. We can kind of go ahead and thread this guy on, and we're going to torque this one down to 47 foot-pounds, which will lock the tension of the inner bolt in place. After we make that torque setting, we can push some of those tabs back and some of them forward. So some will hold the bolt in the back, some will hold the bolt in the front. All right, so once we have that outer bolt on and all the tabs bent in, the last step is to do kind of a resistance test. Well, you can spin the wheel, make sure it spins freely, make sure there's no wobbling in the bearings, but the factory service manual recommends to grab one of these top bolts with a fish scale and kind of pull it laterally. I'm not going to do that because I don't have a fish scale, but I'll post the kind of acceptable range in case you guys do want to do that. But next step is get the gasket and the drive flange on. All right, So once you have the dry flange on, you can put your cone washer, regular washer, bolt, and torque those down to 26 foot-pounds each. And then, like I said, I have this kit of various C-ring sizes for the snap ring there, and you can kind of just like line it up and see which one's the right size. You want to get the biggest one that you can because you want to pull that CV axle into the hub as much as it'll go. The reason for that is that if you look where the CV axle goes into the hub, there's this like metal flange and there's some layers of rubber to keep things sealed. And the tighter that junction is to the hub, the less likely stuff is going to get in there. And you know, just be good not to have excess movement in and out. So you can kind of test out these different C-rings, see which one belongs, and then after that, just tap your dust cap back on, put your brake caliper on, and you're good to go. Job well done.